Good afternoon. My name is Sean Ulmer, Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And I want to thank you all for joining me today for the first in a series of quarterly presentations on the life and work of Grant Wood. This series is born out of the success we had with a series of virtual programs that we did by Zoom last spring, in the spring of 2021, which we had organized to accompany an exhibition that we presented called Grant Wood Revealed, Rarely Seen Works by an American Master. That was a big show, the largest number of works by Grant Wood on view at a single moment in time in history. And we wanted to have a robust educational program to accompany it. The pandemic required that we do that virtually. And so we invited a series of 6 speakers to come and talk about different aspects of Grant Wood's life and work. And with that too, that series was very successful as well as the exhibition. And we decided to extend the exhibition due to popular demand through the summer of last year. And we also extended our educational series through the summer as well. And the bulk of those presentations you can find, if you were interested, you can find them on the museum's YouTube channel. So you go to YouTube, and then in the search line, you type in Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and you click on videos. And there you'll see all of our digital programming that we created during the course of the pandemic, including that wonderful series of Grant Wood presentations. The success of that series prompted us to create an ongoing series because the interest in Grant Wood and his work is definitely there. And so we thought we should continue this series through a quarterly presentation on Grant Wood and his work. And this is the first in that series. So my thanks to you for joining me today in this inaugural event. Today, we're going to look at Grant Wood's 4 trips to Europe in the 1920s. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everyone see my screen there? Those who have video on, could you nod so that I know you can see my screen? Okay, excellent. When you think about Grant Wood and you think about an individual who took 4 trips in a single decade to Europe, it really is kind of phenomenal in and of itself. Artists long to go to Europe in order to see the great masters in person and to soak in the sights and sounds that have inspired so many other artists. But for a young, somewhat struggling artist like Grant Wood, just the concept that he was able to go to Europe 4 times in the course of the 1920s is sort of phenomenal in and of itself. Going to Europe was no easy feat. It was a cumbersome process. You had to sail to Europe. It took a great deal of time to get there and time to get back again. And so it was in and of itself a challenge and an effort. And then there was, of course, the costs associated with it, which were not minor. Those are really interesting factors when you think about the totality of being able to do 4 trips to Europe in a single decade, which I myself would love to do, as well as I'm sure many of you would. And it was wonderful that Grant Wood could do this because it was so very, very transformative to his career. Now, the first trip he took was actually in 1920. And that was a trip to Paris. And this was a trip that really was made possible through his best friend, Marvin Cohn. Marvin Cohn had been to Europe. He had served in Europe during World War I when he was a French translator for 2 generals from Cedar Rapids. While he was awaiting to be shipped back, he was able to take some art courses at an academy in Montpellier in South Central France. This was a fairly common practice with all the GIs that were over in France, they could not all return at the same time. And the French government, in thanks for the contribution of the American soldiers, offered American soldiers, while they were waiting to ship home, to take classes at French universities. And Marvin Cohn availed himself of this opportunity by taking classes at the academy in Montpellier. And he vowed to return to Europe at the earliest possible opportunity, and that he did, returning the very next year. And here you see the precise dates of their travel. It was a summer trip, and Marvin, as I said, took along his good friend Grant Wood along with him, which was actually an extraordinary opportunity for Grant Wood, because here was somebody he could travel with who had been to France before, and somebody who spoke the language fluently, which Grant Wood did not. And there could be no better person really to go to France with than Marvin Cohn. And they shared a room together. They went out painting together. They went and saw the sights together. And then they also did things on their own. But they really both soaked up all of the opportunities that the summer in 20 offered them. And I'm not going to go into specific details on everything that these two artists did. These details are actually well recorded in Marvin Cohn's really beautifully written diary. And I did an Art Bites presentation on Marvin Cohn's diary in January of 2021. It was recorded, and it is on the museum's YouTube page. So if you want to go there, you can. I read the diary and I illustrate it with paintings by both Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus instead on just the paintings, some of the paintings that Grant Wood created on this trip. But if you want a fuller exploration of their time in Paris, I refer you to that recording on YouTube, where you hear exactly what they did on almost every day of their travels in Paris. So, there we go. So the first work I want to share with you is actually a fairly small work that is currently on view in our Grant Wood exhibition, the smaller Grant Wood exhibition that we have up all the time. And this is Misty Day Fountain of the Observatory in Paris from this trip. It's a small work on, on board that would have been easy to acquire the materials. Both Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn painted on board on this trip because, again, the materials were easy to get, and it made packing up the works to bring back to the United States very, very easy. And so all of the works that you see here will be on board, with a few exceptions. And I just wanted to mention that most of the works I'm going to be sharing with you are works from our own collection, unless they are otherwise noted. We have an abundance of work from Grant Wood's travels that we can share with you today. And so unless it's otherwise noted, they are coming from our collection. And this is one such example. The observatory gardens are gardens that sort of append themselves to the Luxembourg Gardens. And the Luxembourg Gardens was a very popular destination in Paris for artists. Both Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood painted in the Luxembourg Gardens. As I said, this observatory garden is a small, skinny garden that kind of goes off of the Luxembourg Gardens towards the observatory. And at the end of it is this wonderful fountain by Carpeaux. And you can see Grant Wood has painted it. Again, this is a fairly small work, really quite intimate, and he is definitely working in the Impressionist style at this point in his career. And Grant Wood, of course, was originally trained as a metalsmith, but as he took up painting, he was painting in the Impressionistic style. And so this is an example, a good early example of that style in his body of work. And that is characterized by like the French Impressionists before, who were active in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, the American Impressionists can pick up where they leave off and kind of make it their own. They are still very much interested in light, like the French Impressionists, and they realize that the same scene looks completely different at different times of day, in different weather conditions, and during different seasons. They are creating an impression, kind of a singular moment in time. And so frequently you will find in the titles of works of art by both French and American Impressionists some reference to either the time of day, the season, or weather condition. And in this case, Grant Wood called this piece Misty Day, Fountain of the Observatory. So Misty Day becomes the primary part of the title. And that's very, very important. It really sort of indicates to us how Grant Wood was thinking about this particular composition. He was really trying to capture the quality of light that one sees on a misty day in Paris, at which really creates its own mood. And that's exactly what Grant Wood successfully captures in this work. And another thing that Impressionism is noted for is for its loose brushwork. And I've got some details here of Misty Day in which you can see how Grant Wood is laying down the brush strokes. He's really trying to capture, again, just an impression, just sort of this momentary fleeting feeling, knowing that in 5 minutes, the entire scene will look different because the quality of light will change. It is really sort of a very momentary thing that they capture. And so there is this, an important sense of capturing that moment as quickly as possible, putting things down in quick brush strokes, which really kind of effectively communicate the scene without laboring over firm outlines. And very, very detailed brushwork. Here, a very close detail of one of the bronze turtles in the fountain that would have been, spewing water as well. Here, also from the same trip, Place de la Concorde from 1920. And this is one of the equestrian statues that flank the entrance to the Tuileries Gardens from the Place de la Concorde. So he's actually standing in the Tuileries, looking back towards the Place de la Concorde, capturing, you can see the obelisk that dominates that place. But his real focus is this equestrian statue, this figure on this winged horse. And here's the statue. It's still in place today, as is the Egyptian obelisk. That was carted there and placed there. But there are other things around. Grant Wood is very, very careful in the way he places himself because he's really focused on this equestrian statue. For example, if you move a little bit further to the right, in the background, you've got the Tour Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower, that was there, of course, then in Grant Wood's time. And he purposely positions himself in a way that that's not in the composition. He did not want that in the composition. Similarly, if you're standing there on the other side of the Place de la Concorde, you are at the foot, really, of the Champs-Élysées, the great big grand avenue that runs from the Place de la Concorde to the Arc de Triomphe, which you see in the distance there. Again, he purposely wanted to kind of keep the Arc de Triomphe out of this scene. He was not interested in capturing these grand landmarks of Paris. Instead, he was really trying to capture the spirit of Paris in this work. And that's true here of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. Here, a rather beautiful church that most people overlook. You can see here, he's really in this impression of Saint-Étienne, captured all of the major particulars of it, but he's got it at a time when the light is hitting the upper portion of the church in really a beautiful way. Now, the reason many people forget this church is because you can see it stands just slightly behind and to the left of the Grand Pantheon in Paris. Pantheon is just a short few steps away from the Luxembourg Gardens. And then just you can see in the background of this photograph, you can actually see Saint-Étienne-du-Mont here. And he's, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead. And he's actually standing on the porch of the Pantheon to capture the image of Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. Again, avoiding a major Parisian landmark in order to get something that is oftentimes more overlooked. Speaking of the Pantheon, here's Grant Wood's Thinker. This is not a work in our collection, but one that is promised to us, I'm happy to say. At this time, the Thinker was sitting out in front of the Pantheon. And he got into a little bit of trouble. He got a little bit too close to this while he was painting it, and the gendarmes came up and talked to him. And the story goes that Marvin Cohn was there to help remedy the situation and explain that he meant to do no harm to Rodin's Thinker, but only wanted to paint an image of it. Here from the newspaper from 1906, when it was placed. So it had not actually been in front of the Pantheon for very long at the time that Grant Wood painted it, and it's not there now. It's brought indoors, so you can't see it if you go to the Pantheon today. It won't be there, but was able to locate through searching the archives this article that sort of tells us when it was placed there and that it was on view there when Grant Wood was visiting. But this is the kind of scene that really dominated Grant Wood's output in Paris in 1920. He wanted to capture what the essence of Paris, what made Paris Paris, basically. These tiny little these intimate little street scenes. Where you do sometimes see figures, as you see in the distance, but they're just so very, very generally put in. It's really about capturing the relationship of these buildings to each other, kind of the massing of the composition. In the center there, you see a little pissoir, which is a public urination spot, which was very common in the day. That's probably, would strike him as perhaps a little bit odd and funny at the same time. It certainly would be an unusual thing to pop into a painting, but not for Grant Wood. I think he kind of relished that. But that's a real slice of Parisian life in 1920, and he captures it. And you can see that he's still operating in a very impressionistic style. He's still very interested in light and shadow, as well as putting things down with a very loose brushwork. Here, another street scene. You can the figures are a little bit clearer, but really they're not as important as sort of this sort of massing of different architectural elements. I mean, Paris was a very old city. And it really sort of grew organically. It was a little bit redesigned by Haussmann in the 19th century, and some of the quirkier sort of organic parts of Parisian architecture were removed to make way for wonderful grand boulevards like the Champs-Élysées. But you could still see in Grant Wood's time portions of Paris that were really sort of very, very old. And sort of created wherever there was space, and I think you get a sense of that when you look at his compositions. Here, from the Roman amphitheater, which is sort of what's left of the Roman ruins of Paris, a woman and baby sitting on a park bench. You can see the carriage next to her, and again, this wonderful massing of architecture. Here in the Lost Estate, I'm not sure of exactly where this is located, but here a figure sitting in front of it, sort of an open gateway. Wonderful, forceful application of paint, and still very interested in the fall of light and shadow on a scene. Another kind of gate or doorway here, a gate in the wall, which is also part of the Roman ruins that existed in Paris at the time. And it's a Roman arch, would have been part of those ruins, and a wonderful cobblestone road or street, as you see here. And it frames beautifully that kind of architecture in the background. Now, that's not to say that Grant Wood did not paint monuments. He did. You can see here's an example that's in the collection of the Cedar Rapids Community School District of Notre Dame. If you follow Marvin Cohn's diary, you know that they went to all of the sites. They were not, they tried several times to get up into the towers of Notre Dame. And so it's not surprising that both he and Marvin Cohn painted Notre Dame, but that was not the primary focus of their trip. So images of major sites in Paris do exist, as you see in this example, and also in these wonderful little drawings that were donated to us not too long ago, of little drawings that of statuary that we've come to be able to identify as statues from one of the portals on the facade of Notre Dame. So it's another example that we know that Grant Wood was, very familiar with Notre Dame. It just did not appear in his work very much. Here, a closer example of one of those figures from one of the three main portals on the facade of Notre Dame, and Grant Wood's drawing of it. But Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn did not spend their entire time on this trip in Paris. They would go out to what you would call the suburbs today. You would need to take a train in their day to get out to them. But Paris continues to grow. And so what was a little further out is now sort of still part of the city today. This is Châtenay, which is a suburb of Paris today. And this is the fountain with a bust of Voltaire on the top of it. And here's a woman filling a pitcher with water from a really kind of a public fountain. And again, you can see there's a real sort of bravura use of brushwork and that dapple of light that kind of is filtering through the tree. And again, this is a perfect example of how impressionists, not just Grant Wood, but all impressionists, know that with the slightest breeze, those light spots would change. They would move. It would not be the same scene. They understood the momentary quality of what they were capturing. Also from Châtenay here, a street scene. Again, very similar to his Parisian street scenes. It's really about the massing. He really is loving these angles in his work. Here, a small, intimate little square in Châtenay, very similar to the small little public areas that he was finding and painting in Paris. And he and Marvin went out to the Ville de Versailles multiple times. And the Ville de Versailles is where Corot's studio had been. And it was sort of a pilgrimage for artists who were visiting Paris, that they would go out to Corot's studio. And here's a painting that he did, a larger painting he did, oil on canvas, that he probably did after his return. Something that is nearly 20 by 24 inches would have been cumbersome for him to deal with. But this is probably something he did when he returned, based on sketches that he made while he was there. And here, a work that's in a private collection. Again, another scene of Corot's pond. They were famous for, there's actually Corot's studio in the distance, famous for being a great place to paint reflections. And they had all of these wonderful low-hanging trees that sort of hung over the water and would create some really wonderful light effects for artists. And here, a painting actually that's been, was donated as a work of Indian Creek, but given the date, we are going to do some more digging, see if we can't determine whether this is truly Indian Creek or if this is instead another image of Corot's Pond, because it certainly looks very, very similar to work that we know that both Grant Wood and Marvin Cone did of the pond at Ville de Versailles. And so I strongly suspect that this is another in that line and not an image of Indian Creek as it purports to be. And they went to Versailles. Versailles is that wonderful palace, home of Louis XIV. And it's grand and it's filled with beautiful gardens and really majestic fountains. And this is what Grant Wood paints. Not the big, grand, popular fountains that people hang around. This is a small fountain off to the side on the grounds of Versailles. It's very, very intimate. And
wanted to shower, so.
And so here, let me see. There is a photograph of the fountains, the Fontin du Soir at Versailles. And as you can see, he's captured a portion of it. He didn't try to do the whole of it. Instead, he's really captured a portion of it. It was a way he could just sort of set up in a very, very small painting that he kind of created what interested him about being at Versailles. And then, of course, when it was raining, and it was raining quite a bit in the summer of 1920, Grant Wood and Marvin Cone had each other to draw and to paint. And here's an intimate little drawing that Grant Wood did with the hopes of creating a plaque, which you see he did after his return, a little plaque in bronze. And they were ready models for each other.
We got three sides.
As well as this self-portrait. One could look into the mirror and be a great subject for oneself as an artist. And here a picture of Grant Wood on sort of just really brown sketching paper that he had with him, which sort of captures this young artist at this really important on this very important trip in his career. And on the way home, on the Grampian, Grant Wood did this sketch of James Bever Norris, and that has recently come into our possession, the gift of the Norris family in 2019. You can see it's actually dated September 1st, 1920. And you can see it's a very good likeness of the individual, but still there's a lot about it that sort of captures that loose quality of in this case, his sort of charcoal strokes. And here I thought it would be fun to throw in this photograph of Grant Wood and Marvin Cone on the Grampian on their way home. You can see sort of clustered there. I'm not sure who the author of the photograph is. It's certainly not either one of them. But here a group of individuals some of whom they had known before, but others that they had met on the boat. And you can see here, Grant Wood is already shaven off his mustache and goatee before returning to the United States. Grant Wood is able to return to Paris in 1923 to study. He takes a sabbatical from teaching at McKinley Junior High School and is able to kind of get away. This is mostly for a year, basically, from July of 23 through September of 24, just in time to kind of start out the school year. And he really is there to study at the Académie Julienne. And this is one of the fine arts schools in Paris. It was one of the more progressive schools. It was one of the first academies to allow women to take classes initially and for quite some time in segregated classes. And it was one of the first academies to let women draw the nude. which was fairly unheard of. So it was a fairly progressive, more affordable academy. And this is where Grant Wood studied from 1923 to 24. Now, when he goes back to Paris, he stays here at this little home of Madame Betat. It's this same place that he and Marvin Cohn stayed in 1920. And he goes back to the same locale where he gets a room. Here, a painting from that trip. This is actually the Street of the Dragon. The Académie Julienne is on the Street of the Dragon. It's not included in this image, but it's the same street that his school was on. So it's not surprising he probably went out and decided he was going to, paint the street, because it is a very interesting looking street, and it very much captures all the things that he's still interested in. The fall of light on surfaces, still very interested in the quality of light, as he is throughout his entire career. And he's still painting in a fairly loose brushwork. Here he returns to the Luxembourg Gardens. This is the Medici Fountain, and it's right next to the Luxembourg Palace. And it's a beautiful fountain that you can still visit today. And you see he's really sort of not done the whole grand alley of water, but instead really focused on how the water is, kind of coming down. And he's very interested in light and shadow. You can see reflection. You can see his wonderful use of loose brushwork. As you see here, he's really just trying to capture, that sort of essence of what the Medici Fountain is. And here, work that's in the Higgy Art Museum, also from the Luxembourg Gardens. Again, his interest in light and shadow could not be more evident in a work like this, where you have these wonderful shadows creeping in from the right, from overhanging trees that you don't see, but still have their presence in their shadow in this scene, and the Luxembourg Palace in the background, which is this time already is a museum. Here are the runners in the Luxembourg Garden, a work that we own. This is a bronze statue that is in front of the orangery that's to the side of the Luxembourg Palace in the Luxembourg Gardens. These figures are no longer outdoors anymore, but they were in Grant Wood's time. And you can see he's very interested in the figures and sort of capturing the light on the building behind. And here in this detail gives you a sense of how he is putting down his paint. You can still see that he's still working very much in an impressionistic style. There we go. Here, a watercolor, which is fairly unusual in Grant Wood's career. The Blue Pole, House with the Blue Pole, also a Parisian scene, one that he would have been able to capture. I imagine being in school, he was encouraged to try different media. And here, another sort of incidental house in Paris. He's really interested in the new plaster, which is what you see that's so very white and bright there, is that this house has been partially replastered and is creating sort of an interesting dichotomy between the new and the old. And again, he's still very interested in these quirky architectural buildings and these wonderful angles that they frequently present to him as really part of the subject of the work. Here an oil on paper, again, sort of very modest support there, but of basically hanging laundry. In Paris, an old staircase, lots of rounded archways, interesting series of massings there, with everyday laundry hanging in the air to dry. In the blue door, again, blue door just sort of beyond this wonderful archway. I mean, even in the 1920 trip and certainly in the 23 and 24 trip, he continues his fascination with passageways, doorways, archways, and so forth. That's something that's of interest to him, throughout the 1920s. And then he does get out to the Bois de Boulogne, which is a very large park on the outskirts of Paris. And there's this wonderful waterfall that you see here that he captured. It's, I guess you could call it one of the sights of Paris, but really would have been more of a site for people who live there as opposed to tourists. But he did sort of venture out and to see some of the natural sites that are sort of well within striking distance of central Paris. And here another site, if you will. This is the Arc du Carrousel in Paris. This is it's not the Arc de Triomphe, it's not the big one that sits at the end of the Champs-Élysées. This is a small Victory Arch that one finds actually near the Louvre. And that's what you see in the background are the buildings of the Louvre. And people overlook this little archway because it's not very far from IMP's beautiful glass pyramid that sort of covers the entrance to the Louvre. Here you can kind of see where it is right now. It's at that juncture point between the Louvre and the Tuileries. And if you look through the left-hand archway, you can see the pyramid, IMP's pyramid, over the entrance to the Louvre in the background. And of course, it wasn't there in Grant Wood's time by any means, but people frequently overlook this archway because they're focused on the Louvre and getting in. But what's interesting is that Grant Wood chose to paint this archway from what one might call the back. You can see in this shot that the statuary on top of the arch is facing towards the Louvre, and he's got the Louvre, through the portals of the archway, as opposed to painting it this way with the Tuileries in the background, with the horses facing you. But he made a very conscious choice to paint this structure from the side that shows the Louvre in the background, that he just sort of kind of sketches sketches in with his loose brushwork. Now on this trip, he was also able to get away briefly to go to Italy on one of the breaks from school. And he does a couple of compositions in Italy. And here's one, an Italian farmyard. And again, he's very interested in doorways and passageways, very interested in the quality of light. It's not uncommon for artists to talk about the quality of light in Italy being distinctly different from the quality of light in Paris. And so here we got a very bright, clear, clean, crisp light that he's captured in this composition. And he also did this very unusual painting of Terrace Mountains. This is on canvas, and do not know if this was done at the time. It's a large canvas. It would have been difficult to paint sort of on site. It may have been something he did back in the studio in Paris, or he could have done it in the studio or in his rooms in Italy. But they're terribly, terribly long. But then you've got the trouble of transporting a large canvas, even if you can't roll it right away because it's going to be wet for a while. So we don't know exactly where he did it. But it is of these wonderful terraced hillsides that one frequently finds on the Amalfi Coast near Sorrento. And you can see how he has captured that wonderful horizon line of the Mediterranean here, which serves as a beautiful backdrop for this terraced mountain. And he's just blocked in the buildings. On that, the buildings and the walls are just sort of blocked in, but totally captures the scene. And again, the love of light and shadow is absolutely present in this work. Now he comes home and moves into the studio here, the Brentwood studio, and is able to get back to France in the spring and part of the summer of 1926. He has an exhibition at the Gallery Carmine in France, and he goes over in April and really begins to create the body of work that is going to be in the show in July of 26. And we have a number of those works, this being a brand new work to our collection that came to us last year. This is the Old Crest in Perjou. He did, the gallery show was in Paris, but he spent most of his time painting outside of Paris, not the suburbs, but a little bit further out, sort of in the Ile-de-France, that geographic region around Paris. Perjou is one of those. And here, a doorway with a wonderful kind of Gothic arch that you see, kind of an ogive Gothic arch. And I was able to find the doorway in preparing for this presentation. I was able to locate it, and you can see he was very faithful to it in its overall forms. He, of course, is still very interested in light and shadow and the play of that across surfaces. Also from Perjou, another doorway. This is a larger work, oil on canvas. This is done a year later. This is done after he has returned from Paris. And we know this because there is a smaller version of this painting that he did on site, that he used as the basis for this larger oil on canvas. That is in a private collection, but we were able to show it in our show last year. Fortunately, we had these two works side by side. You could see what alterations Grant Wood made from the small work to the large work. But he felt it was important enough of a piece to do again, but in larger scale and on canvas, which would have been more expensive a material for him than his usual particle board. And he's very interested in light, the quality of light, and light as it caresses the forms in architecture. And since we have this one, I was able to get some beautiful detail shots so you can still see how he is putting down his pigment, how it's still very, very loose. You get this close to it, you really can't necessarily make out all of the forms. But then when you stand back from it, your eye takes those forms and stitches them together into the overall composition. Saint-Emilion is another location outside of Paris that he went to. Here, an old well, but there's a wonderful doorway in the background, a kind of garden doorway with a wonderful shock of light on one side of it. And here from Saint-Emilion, also the yellow doorway. And again, a work that's all about light and shadow. He's really captured it at the time when the light is coming across it and raking across the surface, because without that light, it doesn't look so interesting. He's really, captured it, I think, at the right moment. This is the Collegiate Church in Saint-Emilion, and that he used. And you can see he's really kind of framed it and truncated it to capture the part that's most interesting on a day where the sun was really working as his friend. I do have another image of it. You can see that he's painted this in golden tones, but the stone itself actually has a certain yellowish cast that I think this photograph makes clear. But with the sunlight, it would become even more golden. And also at Saint-Emilion, this doorway to the bell tower, the porte clocher, that you see here, and here someone wonderfully took a picture that's so very similar to Grant Wood's painting and posted it on the internet. And I found it and I said, my gosh, what a perfect angle, perfect everything for comparison to Grant Wood's painting. Again, this is just the doorway to the bell tower of the monolithic church. Still so very interested in light and makes the scene so much more dramatic and interesting. And here the barred door in Chancelade, which is another city outside of Paris. Haven't been able to locate the source for this one, although I'm, sure I will someday. If not, I'll just have to schedule myself a trip to Chancelade to find it, and that will be fun. But you can see here, you do get a sense of a little bit of that light and shadow, but he just loves the vegetation that's sort of framing the scene. I mean, it's really on all three sides. It really does make it feel like a barred door. And then the little chapel in Chancelade. And this is also another work that we do not have, that's owned by the Higgy Art Museum. And it's still very much around. And still very much has that same slope to the land. And Grant Wood has captured it in all of its sort of general particulars, but created this really interesting sort of sky and foreground for it as well. And I don't know if this was painted on this trip or not, but it would have been something that he certainly could have done. It would have been very easy to take off his shoes and paint them in his studio. But we have to do some more research on this. But this is something that certainly dates from that same year, and it's definitely a kind of studio created piece. But I love how he's really tipped up that tabletop. So that his shoes are presented for us, and I think it's actually really kind of innovative in the way he's dealing with perspective in a composition like this. And then he comes back, and then his fourth trip to Germany, to Europe, is in Germany in 1928, and it was in the fall, basically the entirety of the fall. And this trip was precipitated not by a gallery showing, not by taking classes, and not kind of going over with his good friend Marvin Cohn, but because of this work. He had received the commission for the stained glass window at the Veterans Memorial building in 1927. He does a whole series of wonderful two-scale drawings for the window. And I'll show you a little bit closer here for the window. And when those are completed, he needs to have the window fabricated. So he sends the drawings off to St. Louis, to the Emil Frey Company. They're like, well, this is a really big job. At the time that it was completed, it was the largest stained glass window in the United States. They felt it was just a little bit beyond them, so they sent it to their sort of sister organization in Munich, and to have it fabricated. And so Grant Wood was obliged, along with Emil Frey, to go to Munich, kind of oversee the creation of the stained glass window. And you see him here, front and center, and with some of his drawings in the background. If you are able to see his drawings in person, there are a couple on view at the Veterans Memorial Building in the gallery that they have there. One of the key things that I think Grant Wood needed to do in assistance for the fabrication of these windows is tell the stained glass creators what color every piece of stained glass needed to be. Because as you know, I'm going to go back one here. Along the baseboard there are soldiers from each of the 6 major U.S. conflicts up to Grant Wood's time. And he had done a lot of research to make sure that each of these soldiers was attired in a uniform of that war, and some of them had very specific colorations, which German craftsmen would know nothing about. So if you see in person Grant Wood's drawings, you will see written in different fields there, you will see the colors in German. So you will see the word blau for any segment that needed to be blue, or rot for any segment that needed to be red. And so that was one of the things that he needed to do there. But he also was working diligently on painting the faces of the soldiers. Oops, pardon me, I went ahead there. Painting the faces of the soldiers, and trying to find a way in which that painting would last and not wear off, that they could be somehow fired or baked on to the glass, because he could provide detail in the faces by painting them that he could not get with leading and with glass. So he was very busy for that 3 months, but he was able to get out and do a few other paintings. This is the Blue House in Munich from this trip. This is at the Stanley Museum of Art. And again, very similar to the kinds of things he was interested in when he was in Paris and in France. Here, two figures, again, real interest in light and shadow, and then this wonderful series of angles from architecture. Or here, Marketplace in Nuremberg. He didn't stay just in Munich. He actually did have a little bit of time to explore Germany. It was his first trip to Germany. And so he, here in the Marketplace, I do have a shot of it as well. It's still there with the church in the background.
Just a while with the lights.
And here, we have Yellow House, Red and Yellow House in Munich. Again, very interested in light and shadow that you see on the screen. And it was this trip to Munich and to Germany that was so very, very important to Grant Wood for a number of reasons. It was at this moment that his style begins to change. And there's several factors that contribute to this change in style. One of them was the stained glass window itself. This was a very different work for him, and one in which each section had to be held in place with leading. And so he needed to conceive of his figures and the background and everything with very, very firm lines. And so that really caused him to begin to conceive of figures and landscape in a slightly different way. One would have firm edges. It wasn't going to be the loose edges that one gets with Impressionism. Also on this trip, he saw a number of Northern Renaissance paintings. Certainly when he was in France, he was looking more at Impressionistic works, but in Germany, Northern Renaissance and German works that were influenced by Northern Renaissance painting were in abundance. And here they take a very, very different approach as well. Here, the forms are conceived of with very, very firm outlines. And that is something that was very different from what Grant Wood was doing with his Impressionistic style. And he had also himself been doing portraits prior to going to Europe in 28. We have Sally Stamets from 27 on the left, and John B. Turner Pioneer from 28 on the right, which he had completed prior to his trip. And here, because of the nature of portraiture, the commissioner usually wants the portrait to look very much like the person being portrayed. And so they tend to be, the commissioner tends to be a little bit more interested in things that are not so loosely painted, but something that is sort of firmer painted. And so Grant Wood was already beginning to paint in 27 and 28 with firmer outlines. That, coupled with his work on the stained glass window, and was sort of reinforced by what he was seeing in Northern Renaissance painting, I think all sort of combine to facilitate a change in his style from American Impressionism to what we call his mature style. And you can see sort of comparisons of something like Hans Memling on the left, whom he actually named as somebody who was influential to him, and his Woman with Plants on the right, which he created in 1929, the year after he goes to Germany. And you can see there's a lot of similarities in concept here. The figure near the picture plane holding an attribute in front of an open landscape with a sky with a gradation from light to dark. And also the way in which he, in the case of Woman Plants, a portrait of his mother, the way in which he has really firmed up his outlines. You will see painterly aspects in this painting. If you get up close to it, you will see a somewhat painterly handling of the face and hands as compared to other parts of the work. But on the whole, he's already transitioning into a very different style, one that is much firmer, and very, very different from his American Impressionism. And it's not a very hard leap to see him go from something like Woman with Plants in 1929 to this work in 1930. You can see there's this sort of direct lineage from Woman with Plants to American Gothic. There are elements, again, in the face and the hand that are a little bit more painterly than the rest of it, but this is a totally different style for Grant Wood. This is not American Impressionism at this point. And if you're interested in learning more about Grant Wood's transition in style from Impressionism to what we call his mature style, I invite you to take a look at the Cedar Rapids Public Library's YouTube page. There you'll see a series of recordings for the Grant Wood Writers Forum that is ongoing. And I did a presentation on February 7th, I believe it was, on the transition from American Impressionism to Grant Wood's mature style. If you're interested in seeing more development of that, more examples of that, and where that takes him in his career. I mean, all four of these trips were critical to Grant Wood's growth and development as an artist for different reasons, and they each contributed in their own way. They were each undertaken for different reasons themselves, and it's really this really critical period in Grant Wood's life, the 1920s, when things are changing for him. And this was sort of the last golden age too of Europe. I've traveled to Europe. The 30s for Grant would have been a bad time to go to Europe. Things were becoming very uncomfortable in Europe, and things were leading up to what would become the Second World War. And so it really was a watershed moment for him, and a great place to be at that particular point in his career. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and invite people to ask questions if they like. I've tried to keep it to an hour. I'm not always good at that, but I've succeeded this time around. But so if any of you have to jump off, I understand. But if you'd like to stay around and ask some questions, I will do my best to answer them. Just unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Okay.
Actually, two questions. At the beginning, you mentioned that Marvin Cohn translated for generals. Did he translate for French generals or American generals?
My understanding is they are American generals who were from Cedar Rapids.
Oh, okay.
Who knew we had two American generals who were there? But yeah, that is what I remember reading. I can't recall where exactly off the top of my head, but yeah.
And the other question is, I noticed a lot of the paintings were gifts of the Turners. Does anyone know if they displayed them all in their house? I mean, it sounds like they had quite a few works of Grant's art.
Many of them were displayed in Turner Mortuary. So after, on that 1920 trip, that's where we get most of the Turner pieces from, is the 1920 trip. Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn have a little exhibition on the boat, on the Grampian on their way back. They also have another exhibition when they get to Cedar Rapids. They have an exhibition downtown here. It's because the Turners ended up with so many of them. I believe that they purchased them from him, and they were placed in Turner Mortuary, which Grant Wood had worked on, that transition from a private home, which had been, originally, the Douglas house, then the Sinclair house, to Turner Mortuary. It was all happening right about that same time. It was happening in 24. If I recall, the mortuary opens in December of 24. And it's at that same time that Grant Wood is moving into the studio, that the Turners offer Grant Wood the second floor of the carriage house. And so it's not surprising that the Turners wanted some of his work for the mortuary, because they lots of walls, and they were great supporters of Grant Wood.
Thank you.
John, I have just a couple questions too after Debbie here. First off, did Grant write the titles of his paintings on the back, and date any of them? Or how do we know what that title was?
Sometimes the works are dated next to the signature on the front. So occasionally you will find dates on the front. Not too often, but occasionally. Generally, no, he did not write on the back of them. What we know are from the exhibitions of those work, where the titles were listed in some sort of pamphlet or brochure, and then sort of matching up the titles to the pieces.
A second question, I know there's some controversy over when Grant did Woman with Plants and John B. Turner Pioneer. And I heard you state that you thought that John B. Turner Pioneer was done before he made the trip to Munich, and that it preceded Woman with Plants. Now, some people have said, including Nan Wood Graham, that he did Woman with Plants and then did John B. Turner II. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is my understanding, and I haven't dug into John B. Turner to any great depth, but that's a painting that he painted both in 1928, and then he went back in and painted it some more in 1930. And so it was sort of a transitional piece. It was first an oval, and then it was made into a rectangle. And so he did paint it twice. So Nan's not wrong in that she said that Turner comes after Woman with Plants, because in one aspect it did. But no, we're sure that Woman with Plants was from 29. And from everything that I read, without, like I said, digging too deeply, John B. Turner is double dated, 28 and 30, and I believe that's one that actually has the dates painted on them, I believe, in that. So yeah, it was, but he would have had to complete the 28 portion of that painting before his trip to Munich, because he was gone the entire fall of Munich. So to Munich. So from September through December, he's in Germany. He had to have finished at least the first version, if you will, of Turner prior to leaving.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that it was expensive to go over there. So how did he fund those two trips in the 20s to go with Marvin Cohn?
Well, it varies. He certainly saved his money, but he also had sponsors who would, probably receive their pick of works when he came back. So that was oftentimes the way things were done in those days. Where money would be put up front by local business people. We have more than one example of that happening for both Grant Wood and for Marvin Cohn. And then in one case, I know more clearly in the case of Marvin Cohn, for example, not the 1920 trip, but a subsequent trip, it wasn't really true, it was a sabbatical that he was taking, that was fronted. His salary from teaching at Coe College was fronted by businessmen. And the idea was to go and paint for a year because there were no sabbaticals as we know them today. You just basically took time off and had to find somebody to help you pay for it. The idea was he would paint and then he would sell the paintings in a sale afterwards. And he would pay back his investors and he could keep whatever was left. Now, that's how he funded his sabbatical. This is Marvin Cohn. And not only was that a success, he was actually able to make almost 2 years' salary, I believe, if I remember correctly, almost 2 years' salary out of that sale. And he ended up selling the paintings to the same people who gave him the money in the first place. There was a very enthusiastic and supportive business community here in Cedar Rapids who recognized the talent of both Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn and went out of their way to support them to be able to travel like this and really to live, to be successful artists.
So I had another question about, you mentioned about rolling up the painting and bringing it back. How did he do that, in fact? Because I missed it. I missed but how did he get those pictures back, or those paintings back, of course, on the boat?
Well, most of the paintings are on board. And that was by design because it was easier to transfer them. And that's why whenever we see a work on canvas of a European image, we pause, because we have to think about, well, this would have been really kind of a pain in the neck for him to do. And so we know some of those paintings on canvas were done after his return from those trips. I'm not sure about the Terrace Mountain one that I was talking about. It's a super large piece. And so he very well could have done it on site, or he could have done it afterwards. I'm not quite sure. But most of the paintings that you'll see, both Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn, for that matter, painting are, while they're traveling, are on board. I mean, Grant Wood loved board throughout his career. In fact, if someone tells you that they have an oil on canvas by Grant Wood, that's your first flag, because he painted very rarely on canvas. He loved particle board. He, kind of cut his teeth on it, I think, and was very comfortable with it. And it served him very, very well. The one with plants, American Gothic, Midnight Ride, Daughters of the Revolution, all on board. They're not on canvas, they're all on board. And so when they were traveling, a typical 13 by 15 inch board is what those artists were painting on. And they would pack them up and they would bring them back because they would dry sufficiently enough. You wouldn't want to paint on it the day before you were traveling home, but they would let them dry sufficiently, be able to pack them up, string them together, and bring them back. And interestingly enough, we know from Marvin Cohn's diary that they had to pay duty on their own paintings coming back to the US. So which I thought was an interesting aspect that gets revealed in Marvin Cohn's diaries.
Sean, the diaries of Kohn were so good, and I mean, a nice record. Did Wood keep any record really of his work, or do we know how many paintings he did in that first trip with Kohn? Or it seemed like quite a few paintings we have track of. Do we know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it is a known number because they did do an exhibition when they got back to Cedar Rapids. And I can't remember, I think it might have been at Killian's, I'm not sure, but there is a record of what each artist contributed. He was very, very productive on this trip. Grant Wood did not keep diaries to any great extent. He did, however, on not the 1920 trip. On one of the trips, maybe it was the 23-24. It could have been the 26, but I think it was the 23-24. He actually corresponded. He wrote. He corresponded to the newspaper. He wrote articles for the Evening Gazette. And so you would get kind of these letters home from Grant Wood, basically, in which he kind of details a little bit about his experiences, about the French language, and you get a sense, you get reviews, if you will, of his 1926 gallery show, in which they list the number of paintings. Again, I don't know off the top of my head, but there is a numerical number of paintings that he lists, that are listed in that newspaper article. So you can find out a lot about the specifics of how many works he's creating from actually newspaper accounts. They really did a fairly nice job of following Grant Wood's career.
Thanks, that's great.
But this presentation is being recorded. If you want to go back and double check on anything, give us some days to get this up on our YouTube channel. It will join all of the other presentations that we've been doing on Grant Wood, and others as well. And so if you want to kind of revisit this and take another look at some of the slides, or some of the things that I've said, we'll have it up on our YouTube page probably within a week or so. So I do appreciate your joining me today. We'll do another one of these Grant Wood in Focus series presentations in June. Kate Kunau, our curator here, will do that presentation. The exact date is sort of to be determined yet. And I believe she's going to take a different look at Grant Wood's Impressionism. And so I invite you back at that time. Just check our website, or if you don't already, subscribe to our weekly e-blasts. It gives you all the kind of information on all the different programs that we're doing. So again, thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good rest of your weekend.